Welcome to the Prophecy Club, where we study and research Bible prophecy. Tonight's topic is Soviet war plans for America. Is American prophecy? Is it true that the Bible does talk about it in America? And does the Bible really say that Russia is going to attack America? Well, we believe it does. And our speaker tonight comes from a very unique angle. Now, if a person has not believed the prophets that say trouble is coming to America, if they have not believed the police officers or the military officers or the myriad of other speakers that we've had in that essentially all say that trouble is coming to this nation, perhaps they'll believe it from a different angle. Perhaps tonight from the defector angle. What am I talking about? Well, there have been many people that have defected from the Soviet Union. And when they get over here, many of them go to writing books and telling their story. And I talked to Stanislav Lunev, and it is on his heart to tell people that America is in trouble. And guess what? He gets over here to discover that Americans don't want to hear that the Soviets plan to bomb them off the map. Now, that doesn't even make sense, does it? Well, your speaker tonight has not only studied what Stanislav Lunev has said, but also many other speakers. As a matter of fact, he's been researching what the Soviet Union plans for America for some 15 years. He's read over 750 books on the subject. He has researched in the area of political science for 2 years. Will you help me welcome Jeff Nyquist?
Well, it's nice to be here at the Prophecy Club, and we live in an age of opposites. One of the things I'm going to discuss with you tonight is how things are not what they appear, but sometimes are the opposite. We know we have a president who said that he smoked marijuana, but he didn't inhale, that he had an affair, but he didn't have sex, that he told lies, but he did not commit perjury. We also know we had communist regimes all over the world that were promising prosperity and delivering poverty, promising war, promising peace and delivering war, and also promising freedom and delivering tyranny. Now, more recently, one of the greatest communist tyrannies turned to a democracy. And here is what Pfeiffer, the cartoonist, says about it. He notices, he calls this the 1990s a post-communist history. And he begins with the collapse of Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the death of socialism, the triumph of democracy, the triumph of capitalism, the triumph of nationalism, the emergence of many nations, the emergence of ethnocentrism, the collapse of democracy, the collapse of capitalism, the triumph of religious fundamentalism, the collapse of religious fundamentalism, the triumph of chaos, the emergence of socialism. This cartoon was written in 1992, but it captures the process that we are witnessing. Just this past week on the TV, we saw millions of Russian workers protesting Yeltsin's democracy in Russia. They were holding up red flags. They were not matadors at a bull ring. Those red flags were communist flags. What is it all about, communism? From the Lenin School of Political Warfare, we get the following. War to the hilt between communism and capitalism is inevitable. Today, of course, we are not strong enough to attack. Our time will come in 30 or 40 years. To win, we shall need the element of surprise. The Western world will need to be put to sleep. So we shall begin by launching the most spectacular peace movement on record. There shall be electrifying overtures and unheard of concessions. The capitalist countries, stupid and decadent, will rejoice to cooperate in their own destruction. They will leap at another chance to be friends. As soon as their guard is down, we shall smash them. Dmitry Z. Manielsky, Lenin School of Political Warfare, Moscow, 1931. A whole generation of Soviet leaders were educated at the Lenin School. Lenin was the founder of the Soviet Union. Their doctrine is called Marxism-Leninism, is also called dialectical materialism. We know what the materialist part of their doctrine is. It is, in essence, atheism. There is no God, there's no heaven or hell to them. There is no soul in man. We're merely biological robots. But the dialectic part, remember I was talking a little while ago about opposites, both in terms of our president and the Soviet regime. The unification of opposites through the conflict of their contradictions result in a synthesis. And you see here the thesis, the antithesis with contradictions and a synthesis. That's the simple dialectic. Now an example that Marx gives. The bourgeoisie, that's people who own their own businesses, people who employ others. The proletariat, those are people who work for other people. Contradictions between them resulting in a communist revolution and then a communist society. Let's look at communism's view of history overall. To the communists, it begins with primitive communism. See, a caveman doesn't have any property. There's no class distinctions. You know, one caveman might have a better stone or rock than another caveman, but it doesn't really matter much until you have tool making. Then you start getting distinctions. Private property, emergence of classes, haves and have-nots. The early societies, class societies, were slave societies with slave owners and slaves. The contradictions there resulted in feudal society, which brought about aristocracy and bourgeoisie. Their contradictions led to the liberal revolutions in capitalist society. And then we get back to where we started from. You notice proletariat and bourgeoisie, and then the revolution, which ends in developed communism. Now you notice how we begin with primitive communism and we end with developed communism in the communist idea of history. Man returns to himself. Man is essentially a communist being. And the historical process is merely a way from going from the caveman communist to the rocket man communist. Now, it is all, this entire process happens through the contradictions of opposites. Now, I'm going to discuss tonight with you the Soviet war plan to conquer America, which is the main enemy of the Soviet Union, was from the very beginning. There are two opposite strategic theories which the communists employ. These theories begin with Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War. He was a Chinese general who lived about 2,500 years ago. And he wrote, "Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting." Very significant. Then he goes on, "All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when we are able to attack, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe that we are away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. Hold out baits to entice the enemy, feign disorder, and crush him." Now he adds below, "He will conquer who has learnt the artifice of deviation. Such is the art of maneuvering." Now, the opposite of Sun Tzu is the Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz. And Karl von Clausewitz in On War, under the title Utmost Use of Force, wrote, "Now a philanthropist may easily imagine there is a skillful method of disarming and overcoming an enemy without causing great bloodshed, and that this is the proper tendency of the art of war. However plausible this may appear, still it is an error which must be extirpated." Then he continues, "He who uses force unsparingly, without reference to the bloodshed involved, must obtain superiority if his adversary uses less vigor in its application. The former then dictates the law to the latter. If I am more bloody and violent than you are, I will intimidate you, I will force you to do what I want." And that is Clausewitz. The bloody path, the battle. His emphasis is on the decision that's brought about through this bloody encounter. While Sun Tzu puts his emphasis on deception, not the battle. The Soviet strategists decided to combine the two theories into one greater dialectical whole. The Marshal of the Soviet Union and Chief of the General Staff, Sokolovsky, in 1956, was an advocate of Clausewitz. The KGB general Nikolai Mironov was an advocate of Sun Tzu, winning without fighting. The two of them, the KGB general and the army general, got together and created this synthesis. That was the Communist Bloc's strategy. It was a process that went on for more than a year. They met in the fall of 1956 until the spring of 1957, and then passed some of their work off to other committees. Now this is Nikita Khrushchev. He was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time that these new arrangements, these new plans were drawn up. Khrushchev had a big disagreement with his predecessor, Joseph Stalin. Stalin's methods were rather straightforward in some areas. But Khrushchev believed that a more sophisticated approach was necessary for the communist revolution to dominate the world overall. Khrushchev liked to drink. Armenian cognac was one of his favorites. And at a NATO party, he gave away some of the game plan in an outburst that he had with some NATO diplomats that were also at the party. Khrushchev said as follows, and maybe some of you will remember this: "Your grandchildren will live under communism." Now, it's a very interesting statement because he doesn't say you will live under communism. He doesn't say your children will live under communism. He says your grandchildren will live under communism. And he said this about 40 years ago. So we're about the grandchildren now. That's about where we've arrived. So he was talking about, he obviously was giving away a plan, the idea of a long-range plan that would take not just one generation, but would take an extended period of time. Something that would happen even after he was dead himself. Now he goes on, he went on to make the following statement in relation to this first one. He said, "Capitalism is a worn-out mare, while socialism is new, young, and full of teeming energy. Our firm conviction is that sooner or later, capitalism will give way to socialism. No one can halt man's forward movement, just as no one can prevent day following night. Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you." And then he added a curious little note at the bottom. Afterwards he said, "We will give up communism when crabs learn to sing." Now it's a very funny thing. Crabs have apparently learned to sing. And they've sung quite a bit in the last several years. But as we know with the movies, Steven Spielberg and whatnot, that all kinds of funny-looking critters can be made to do improbable things. And the funny little critters in Moscow have followed in suit. They have not been left behind by Hollywood. This was the committee, the Brezhnev Committee, which was set up by Khrushchev to create this, to design this plan. Now, if you ever wondered how it was that Leonid Brezhnev came to succeed Khrushchev, it was because of his leading role in the formulation of their strategy. He was the committee chairman. Under him was Mikhail Suslov, later the ideology chief of the USSR. And here we see again Marshal Sokolovsky, the chief of the Soviet General Staff. And he was in charge of the military subcommittee, which was responsible for making the nuclear war plan. Being a Clausewitzian, he believed the bloody path, the bloody decision, was the way to go. And in this case, it meant a thermonuclear war. Dmitry Ustinov, a genius, the creator and builder of Russia's strategic rocket forces and her vast nuclear arsenal. Boris Ponomarov, Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, Foreign Policy. It was his job to break up the Western alliances through diplomacy and to devise within the plan ways of creating new alliance blocs and isolate the United States. There he is again, KGB General Nikolai Mironov. He was in charge of the Intelligence Subcommittee, which was responsible for deception planning. And under him was Alexander Shelepin. After this committee met, Alexander Shelepin was made head of the KGB. And his specific assignment was to reorganize the KGB in order to carry out the plan. In fact, it was under Shelepin that the disinformation department of the KGB was formed. Immediately after the committee had solidified its policies and ideas, Marshal Sokolovsky and his military theorists went to work. They wrote and published this book, Soviet Military Strategy. Sokolovsky's the editor. This book is current reading in Russia's military and war colleges today. They haven't even bothered changing the title. It is very up to date. It was written as a theoretical work to describe how you can prevail and prepare for a strategic nuclear missile war. In essence, to give it to you in a few short terms, a nuclear missile war is just like any other war, only it begins with an exchange of nuclear rockets. The preparation of this war involves building deep underground shelters for the population, training them in how to defend themselves against biological, nuclear, and chemical weapons, and also stockpiling food underground and building anti-ballistic missiles. It also involves sending millions of troops into the enemy territory at a rapid rate of speed to occupy it and convert the survivors after the first nuclear strikes. Because of the high rate of casualties anticipated in a nuclear war, the Soviets would expect to raise an army perhaps in excess of 30 million during the course of the war, because the casualties would be so huge. Now, while Sokolovsky and his marshals were busy working on the military aspect of the plan, KGB General Alexander Shelepin, also known as Iron Shurik, was working on organizing the deception part of the plan for Nikolai Mironov. This is Alexander Shelepin. He headed the KGB from 1958 until around 1964. He then became head of the Interior, Minister of the Interior, and then later worked on the Labor Ministry in creating communist labor unions, which was very important in the later phase of their long-range strategy. Now, the importance of Shelepin is that in 1959, General Shelepin delivered a report to high-ranking KGB and party officials called the Shelepin Report. In that report, he outlined the elements necessary for the long-range deception strategy. The key element was to create Soviet-controlled anti-Soviet movements in Russia and the other Eastern Bloc countries. I'll give you an idea of what this would constitute. Suppose a guy is a secret police agent. He starts making anti-Soviet statements. They put a camera on him. They make him famous. People follow him. This is a Soviet-controlled anti-Soviet movement. The secret police has created its own opposition and thereby can lead it in any direction it wants. Another key element in the strategy was outlined by Shelepin in a lecture he gave at the KGB Academy. It was about false splits within the communist bloc. General Shelepin talked about the Tito-Stalin split, which occurred after World War II. Tito, the communist dictator of Yugoslavia, fell out with Stalin, the communist dictator of Russia. Stalin sent a hit squad to kill Tito. Tito intercepted them and sent a man to see Stalin with a note that said "boom" on it. Stalin got the note, changed colors, decided to leave Tito alone. That was the split. But the interesting thing about this splitting of one communist country breaking from Moscow is that the West, particularly the United States, rushed in to support communist Yugoslavia, to give it money, credits, some technical assistance. And Alexander Shelepin thought this was a very interesting development because he felt that if the communist bloc could have a false split within its ranks, the West would rush in and give all those goodies to a genuinely communist country, to a genuine partner of the Soviet Union. Now, at the end of his lecture, one of the KGB officers raised his hand and said, "Comrade General Shelepin, what country do you propose for this false split?" And he said, "China." Now, that was 1959, and that was the year before the Sino-Soviet split began. Coincidence? Let's see what Deng Xiaoping, the longtime leader, communist leader in China who died recently, this is what he is quoted as saying in a book covering his beginning of his period in power. In 1977, Deng Xiaoping spoke of the international united front struggle about which the American imperialists know absolutely nothing. "We belong to the Marxist camp and can never be so thoughtless that we cannot distinguish friends from enemies. Deng ended by saying that all future American leaders were enemies, but China needed technical assistance. Deng emphasized that in the future, due to the United Front strategy, America will have no way of avoiding defeat by our hands. Now, that is a very interesting quote. When I was with Colonel Stanislav Lunev a few weeks ago in Washington, I got a chance to ask him about China, because Lunev speaks fluent Chinese and worked for a few years in China as a spy for the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff. And as you might know, China formed an alliance with Russia in 1992 in which their intelligence services share all information with each other. Well, what's interesting is that Lunev told me that he felt that this alliance was probably in force back in the 80s, secretly, because of certain things he saw when he was there. It all fits. Now, let's just go over a larger diagram of the deception strategy, and we can see here some of the things I've talked about already that Shelepin is famous for outlining. Under the deception element of the strategy, false splits in the communist bloc, we mentioned that. KGB-controlled dissident movement, okay, we mentioned that. Now here's another one, fake collapse of the Warsaw Pact. Very interesting. We have this from two defectors who came over and told us that, and I'm going to cover that in a few minutes. Fake collapse of the Warsaw Pact. Then 4, deceptive disarmament. And then 5, trumpet Russia's failures and losses. Now, while all of this deception is going on, the Russians will continue with their sabotage, subversion, drug trafficking operations, organized crime, and blackmail of Western politicians. Also, they will continue with their revolutions in the Third World. Now, below that is the battle exploitation part of the plan. And here's where Marshal Sokolovsky, you could probably see him rubbing his hands saying, you know, this deception isn't so bad after all. You know, I could live with this. They're going to give me all the rockets and the bombs that I want. Dmitry Ustinov will see to that. But, hey, you know, if this deception even partially works, I might be able to achieve complete surprise, and we'll have a good shot at winning this thermonuclear war thing. And here under that, to covertly expand the military power, to retain key elements for rebuilding the army. That's mainly the key elements would be division commanders, specialists, and generals who take a long time to train. You can create a soldier in 8 weeks. It takes a lot of time to create the specialists, so you build up your army around the specialists, which is what they've done. And then 3, use diplomacy to divide and conquer. And 4, attack the West with one clenched fist. Now, does this deception have any chance of working? Isn't this a bit far-fetched, the idea that people are so easily duped that you could pull something so vast on them? I mean, after all, we knew many years ago that the Soviet Union was our enemy. Well, here's what Machiavelli says about a deceiver never lacking dupes. In his Prince, How Princes Should Honor Their Word, he says, men in general judge by their eyes rather than by their hands. Because everyone is in a position to watch, few are in a position to come in close touch with you. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are, and those few dare not gainsay the many who are backed by the majesty of the state. Now, we're all watchers, aren't we? We get all our news from 90-second sound bites on the television. In fact, we're the ultimate watchers, and very few of us are close enough to actually feel what these people are. That's what research is all about, taking a closer look. That pretty lady down the block from 100 yards, when you get up close, find out that it's a man, it's a hippie. You know, things look different from far away than they are up close. Now, this book, New Lies for Old, was written by KGB defector Major Anatoly Golitsyn. He worked for Alexander Shelepin at the time that Shelepin was reorganizing the KGB to carry out the long-range strategy. Major Golitsyn wrote this book, New Lies for Old, in 1984. And he made some very interesting predictions in the book. He said that in 1968, the liberalization in Czechoslovakia, which resulted in the invasion of the Warsaw Pact countries of Czechoslovakia, was a dress rehearsal for a larger liberalization which was slated to occur in the Soviet Union. Its purpose would be to dazzle the West, and it would run along the lines of a carefully staged play. Here's an interesting quote from Golitsyn's book. He writes, "The Czechoslovaks, in contrast with the performance in 1968, might well take the initiative, along with the Romanians and Yugoslavs, in proposing the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and return of the dissolution of NATO." Now note the red underlined part. The disappearance of the Warsaw Pact would have little effect on the coordination of the communist bloc, but the dissolution of NATO could well mean the departure of American forces from the European continent and closer European alignment with the liberalized Soviet bloc. Now it's interesting. In 1990, 6 years after this was written, the Warsaw Pact collapsed. And one of the major calls on the part of Moscow was for NATO to also fold shop. Now, George Bush resisted this, so NATO still exists, but the Soviets went to Plan B, to get the Warsaw Pact countries into NATO. Now that's interesting because Sun Tzu said, one of the best deceptions is to enter the enemy's camp, to pretend to be with him. Now, let's see what other predictions Golitsyn made. Liberalization, he wrote, in Eastern Europe would probably involve the return to power in Czechoslovakia of Dubček and his associates. That's interesting because Dubček did return to power, not as president, but as Speaker of the Czech Parliament. Then he goes on, if it should be extended to East Germany, demolition of the Berlin Wall might even be contemplated. Now, nobody was suggesting in 1984 that the Berlin Wall would go down. In fact, Golitsyn received criticism for publicly making this prediction in 1984. Now, I'll move this up a bit so you can read this next quote clearly. The next quote is from a different defector altogether. Major General Jan Sejna, the highest-ranking communist official to defect from the Eastern Bloc. He defected in 1968 and had been shown the plan in detail in 1967. In his 1982 book, We Will Bury You, he wrote the following curious passage. The erosion of NATO begun in phase 2 of the plan would be completed. To this end, we envisioned that it might be necessary to, and you see I've underlined it, dissolve the Warsaw Pact, in which event we had already prepared a web of bilateral defense arrangements to be supervised by secret committees of Comecon. Now that's very interesting. I just want to emphasize this. We'll go back to this other transparency, and I'll read the part just before the underlined part. It says, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, a return of the dissolution of NATO, the disappearance of the Warsaw Pact would have little effect on the coordination of the communist bloc. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is a very significant find, and this is what set me going on this in the beginning. I found this in 1987, 2 years before the liberalization really hit big time in the fall of the Berlin Wall. I really didn't take Golitsyn seriously when I read his book in 1984, but when I read Major General Sejna's statement, I said, whoa, wait a minute. There's two defectors whose bona fides are unquestionable, who assisted the West, both the British and the Americans, in many operations, and their knowledge was indispensable, and they both risked their lives to come over here, and they were both saying there was a long-range plan, and that plan involved the deceptive collapse of the Communist Alliance. Now that's not proof, ladies and gentlemen, but that's a reason to look closer at everything that happens over there. And I'm going to share with you what I found when I looked closer. Now I'll continue with some of the quotes. This is what Sejna said about the plan in his book. Let me move this over. Okay, here we go. The Soviet strategic plan for the establishment of their socialism worldwide does without doubt exist, and however flexible and pragmatic Soviet policy appears, it is essentially directed toward the achievements of the plan's objectives, objectives which have been, are, and will remain utterly inimical to and subversive of the freedom enjoyed by the states of the Western world. This is a very clear statement about what the plan's goals are. Now, I have a further quote that aligns with this. Now, you might be thinking in your head, oh, it's a wild conspiracy. I mean, didn't Khrushchev get booted out of office for harebrained scheming? Well, what was that meant to cover? Maybe they were afraid we knew about that scheme, and firing Khrushchev maybe would make us think they dropped it. This is what Lenin wrote about the Communist Party that he founded. He said, it would be extremely naive indeed to fear the charge that we desire to create a conspiratorial organization. No, let's not be afraid of being called conspirators, is what Lenin is saying. We are conspirators. If people accuse us of being that, we embrace it, because that's precisely what we are. Now, here's what Golitsyn writes further. He says, but as in the Czechoslovak case, the liberalization would be calculated and deceptive in that it would be introduced from above. It would be carried out by the party through its cells and individual members in government, the Supreme Soviet, the courts, and the electoral machinery, and by the KGB through its agents among the intellectuals and scientists. It would be the culmination of Shelepin's plans. It would contribute to the stabilization of the regime at home and to the achievement of its goals abroad. Very interesting. What is the name of this deception operation? Does it have a name? Yes. Operation Golgotha. What is Golgotha? Golgotha is the place where Christ was crucified. Now, what happened after Golgotha? Christ rose from the dead. In their blasphemous way, the communists are mimicking Christ. The Soviet Union is undergoing its crucifixion and its burial. But the intention is clear from the code name. The intention is to resurrect communism, to bring it back. Here is what Gorbachev himself said on 17 May 1996. The New York Times reported on its front page. He was addressing a small audience in the tiny village of, don't ask me to pronounce it. He said, I will fight to the bitter end, even if you crucify me. I am reminded of Jesus Christ on the way to Golgotha, how he walked through the streets and people spat at him. This is what Gorbachev said 2 years ago. Now, Chris Story, a researcher in England who publishes Soviet Analyst, comments on this. He says, Golgotha was and remains the Soviet intelligence community's name for the bold Bolshevik strategic deception plan to fold communism and to abolish the USSR. Now why? What do they really hope to achieve by this extravagant Potemkin village, this show of democracy, this controlled liberalization? Well, perestroika was Stalin's favorite word. It means restructuring. Stalin, he used this word in terms of lining up his fellow government officials in front of firing squads and executing them and then cashiering them for other ones. But later on, this became a different matter. In our time, perestroika does not just simply mean restructuring in Russia. It means restructuring the Western mind, and especially, consequently, the American military machine. Before perestroika, before Gorbachev came in and started the liberalization and the changes over there, we had 27 army divisions. By 1995, we had 15, and in red I've penciled in there, today we have 10. That is an astonishing disarmament. Or I should say, an astonishing perestroika. 37 Air Force wings in 1985, 20 in 1995, 13 today. 542 Navy ships in 1985, 346 by 95, 339 today. More important, 36,000 nuclear warheads in 1985, 12,000 nuclear warheads today. SDI research, it was going on in 1985. Today, it is dead. Now, what else can they achieve with this perestroika, this restructuring? Part of the restructuring is called the creation of nuclear-free zones. It's a very ingenious technique. You see this particular news item, it says Ukraine counter-spy leads an anti-nuclear mission. What is he doing? He's escorting nuclear warheads out of the Ukraine into Russia. You see, what they're doing is they're pulling all the nuclear weapons out of places like Eastern and Western Europe and most of the republics of the Soviet Union. Why? So that these countries, these whole regions, will not be targeted in a general nuclear war. That means that the Soviet Union, now reduced to Russia, if it should have a nuclear war with the United States, would only suffer bombardment in the Russian part of the Soviet Union. The other republics would be free of damage. This is better than having a good ABM defense. It's foolproof. In a nuclear war, we would imagine that Belarus, the Baltic states, and Ukraine are neutral countries. We would not fire on them, but they would still be important for the recovery and further military operations of the Soviets. Now, or the Russians, whatever you want to call them. Can we prove that this operation that was discussed so long ago and told to us by defectors, can we believe it's happened? Can we find evidence that it's going on? I met this man, Wojciech Myslecki, in 1990 when he came to this country to speak. He was head of Warsaw's Technical University, a major leader in Solidarity. He was jailed with the crackdown in the early 80s, and he was fired from his position at the university. I mean, this man sacrificed everything and was willing to sacrifice his life for the freedom of his country against communism. What he told me about Solidarity in Poland and Lech Walesa was shocking. He said that Lech Walesa was the secret creature of the communist regime. He said that the communists had been joining Solidarity to take it over from within, that they had successfully hijacked the movement and captured it, and were using it to fool the West. He said that years before Lech Walesa had been famous, he had gone from labor union meeting to labor union meeting where the communist officials were asking to create communist labor unions. Who will help us? And Lech Walesa was the one who would jump up at the back of the room and say, I will help you, comrades, I will help you. You see, they made Lech Walesa an international figure by pointing cameras at him. In a totalitarian regime, who do you think gets the camera attention? Not this man. They wouldn't point a camera at the real thing. They pointed it at their own secret agent. This is a classic example of what General Shelepin was talking about when he talked about communist-controlled anti-communist movements. Further evidence from Romania. The Hole in the Flag, written by Andrei Codrescu, an internationally famous radio commentator, poet, and author. You maybe saw him during the December Revolution in Romania on Nightline with Ted Koppel. He was one of the first Western journalists into Romania. Now, he grew up in Romania. He left that country as I remember, when he was about 25 years old. And what's really interesting is what he found out when he got into Romania. See, he chastises himself in this book for falling for the trick of the revolution. He went to his hometown in Transylvania, Timisoara, where the revolution started, and he was up late at night for one reason or another, couldn't sleep, and he ran into a Russian journalist. The Russian journalist offered to have some drinks with him. So he said, sure, why not? So when they were drinking, the Russian journalist mentioned that he'd come there with a large number of Russian journalists 10 days before anything happened, before the revolution started, in this small Transylvanian village. Well, Codrescu thought, wait a minute, what would all those Russian journalists be coming into this little Transylvanian town 10 days before anything happened? And the Russian winked at him. So he said, wait a minute, you mean Moscow knew in advance there would be a revolution? And he winked again. And Codrescu thought, oh no, you're kidding. You mean, no, they were behind it? And he winked a third time. It's very interesting what he found out then when he went to look closer. Here's what Codrescu writes about the revolution. And it's quite in keeping with the idea that this was directed by the KGB. He wrote, "A process of mass hypnosis was going on, aided in part by the desire on the part of the world to believe that communism had finally come to an end in a spectacular and definitive way. The Romanian Revolution would have been a neat closure to the stunning collapse of communist bureaucracies. The only trouble is that it wasn't closure. More troubling than that, it was a skillfully staged play." Very interesting. That's exactly what we would expect to find if Golitsyn and Sena are right and they are continuing to follow this long-range deception strategy. Codrescu further explains, bit by bit, the biographical profiles of Romania's new leaders began to emerge, leading one to the inescapable conclusion that links between them had been forged in the deepest recesses of the Communist Party, and that many of them were connected directly to the mother party in Moscow. Aha! The center of the entire operation. Now we'll go to the quote below. Ted Koppel found out that the dead children on the steps of the Timisoara Cathedral were a fabrication. An independent videotape taken seconds later at the spot showed no bodies at all. Many things in the Romanian Revolution were fabrications. Many of the corpses and dead bodies left out, what they did is they dug up graveyards and put bullet holes through some of the corpses, took footage of them, said that they were slaughtered by the secret police. They sent out the sound of machine gun fire over loudspeakers. Oh yes, there was fighting. Buildings got burned, but it wasn't the thousands upon thousands that died that we were led to believe. It was a coup. Moscow removed Ceausescu and replaced him with men who would more precisely and diligently carry out the deception strategy in Romania. Now, what about the Gulag Archipelago? The famous system of concentration camps and prisons known through the works of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This was smuggled out, this next letter was smuggled out of Shevardnadze's Georgia in 1993. Shevardnadze, the great friend of Gorbachev, the liberal, the Democrat, Shevardnadze. This is what the prisoner writes. On 6th September, that's 93, KGB investigators came and began to torture me for many hours. The prosecutor general A. Balashvili started a filthy bargaining session with me. If I confessed, he would leave my children alive. Then he brought my children to me and said, "If you do not pity yourself, pity your children." In Isolation Ward 2, there are brood hens in almost every cell. Their job is to try to force prisoners to make confessions. Prisoners are routinely attacked from all sides by KGB investigators, executioners, by the prison administration, and by the other prisoners. I have been thinking of committing suicide. What kind of a regime are we talking about? This is not democratic. This is not by law. The police forcing a confession from a man by threatening the lives of his children? I don't think that we see much change in that. And Edward Shevardnadze, the Democrat, is actually an MVD general, a general of the Ministry of Interior, which runs the concentration camps and prisons. Himself a jailer. Chris Story, the researcher I mentioned earlier in England, who edits Soviet Analyst, wrote to Avraham Shifrin, the world's leading expert in the Soviet concentration camps and the Gulag. Shifrin had written the first guidebook to prisons and concentration camps in the USSR back in the 80s. And this is what Shifrin wrote back to Story about the situation in the camps in Russia. He writes, basically, the situation in the camps of Russia, the Ukraine, as well as other parts of the USSR, with the exception of the Baltic states, has not changed. As a matter of fact, the Russian authorities have to transform their entire industry and base it on the forced labor of prisoners. For this purpose, the camps, within the last few years, have been gradually enlarged, and their prisoners are being used at the surrounding plants and construction sites. And then the letter continues. Such a policy is an inevitable result of the fact that free workers are trying to flee from the provinces where they are systematically denied even their meager salaries. The timber cutting industry remains unchanged, which is no wonder, as nobody wishes to work there in the taiga for very low pay, without elementary life conditions, in temporary barracks, without shops, cinema, etc. Add to this that wood cutting is extremely hard work, given the lack of necessary machinery. Therefore, forced labor is the only way to man the industry. So the authorities have created new camps and keep moving them deeper into the forests. Now, how about the uranium industry in Russia? You see, they never developed the safety standards we did or the safety equipment for mining this safely. And so, prison labor. And they breathe the uranium dust and the other hazardous materials in the mines. And their average lifespan is 4 months. They literally work them to death. Shiffrin continues his letter. I cannot say for sure when exactly the camps I wrote about were created, but I can say that this information has been collected during a recent couple of years. Now, Shiffrin wrote this letter in June of 1996, well into Yeltsin's democratic tenure. And it continues. I do not think my sources would write about old camps. One of the very significant circumstantial evidences that the system remains unchanged is the fact that none of those whose hands are washed in the blood of innocent Gulag victims has been tried and punished. The total number of KGB personnel has grown twofold within the perestroika period. In fact, there has been no real perestroika, as the power remains in the hands of the same people who were previously called communists and are now called, what are they called? Democrats and liberals. The West believes the Russian lies as it wants to believe there will be a quiet life, but there won't be. Now, if you don't believe Shiffrin, if maybe you think, oh, well, this guy has to be crazy. I saw them close the Gulag on the 6 o'clock news. Well, how about the U.S. State Department? Its 1996 March Human Rights Report on Yeltsin's Russia. This is what it said. The Ministry of Interior, MVD, is responsible for 743 labor camps, 168 remand institutions, and 13 prisons. In addition, the MVD maintains 60 education camps for young people. According to reports, prisoners have died after being tortured by members of the security forces, or as a result of inadequate sanitary conditions, or lack of medical treatment. Sounds like a change to you? The only thing wrong I can see with the report is that it grossly underestimates the size of the Gulag because the State Department has limited sources of information. Here is what Story reports via Shiffrin about the actual size of the Gulag in Russia in 1990. And then since we just read that they'd increased the prison labor force by 1996, that it's going to even be larger than what it says here. In January 1990, Avraham Shiffrin reported in his open letter entitled A Performance, Glasnost and Perestroika, that some 2,500 camps were now under the enlightened Gorbachev, holding an expanded population of 7 million inmates. In subsequent statements, he has insisted that many new camps have been constructed throughout the former USSR, in addition to the existing network of Gulag establishments. Some of these installations, which remain empty, may be earmarked for West Europeans after an invasion of Western Europe by the Soviet military. Well, obviously, you have to have somewhere to put all those new prisoners. But the lies don't end just with the Gulag. Let's go to one of the more spectacular ones. Leonid Shebarshin was head of the foreign intelligence part of the KGB, the SVR. And when he retired, he did something unprecedented. He bragged about his own failures. Now, normally when people retire after a lifetime of service, they count up their successes, but not Mr. Shebarshin. He said that the CIA, the French intelligence, and the German intelligence beat the Soviet intelligence hands down during the Cold War. He wants to make us believe that they never had a mole in the CIA, that they weren't able to recruit all that many Americans. Oh, they got the walkers, and they were able to bribe a few enlisted men and maybe a few military officers there in the 80s, but they never made any significant penetrations. Of course, within months of this pronouncement, in 1993, Shebarshin had to eat his words. Aldrich Ames was arrested by the FBI for being a mole within the upper reaches of the CIA. Aldrich Ames, at one time, was head of the Czechoslovak department of the CIA, or Czechoslovak subdivision. Now, this says the CIA saw nothing unusual in Ames. Does it look to you like the CIA was the one that was outgunned, outfooled by the KGB? Yes. In fact, about 2 years after this, they found another, even higher-ranking mole in the CIA, Mr. Nicholson. And now, today, on the news, there was a further report about a spy within the National Security Agency. I'm afraid that these are just the tip of a much larger iceberg. But what about secrecy in Russia? Can they keep their secrets? Yeah, you bet they can. In fact, Boris Yeltsin made sure of this. When he took power in 1992, he did something interesting. He wanted to protect us all from terrorists who might steal Russia's nuclear secrets. So Russia isolates secret nuclear research cities. Oh, he wasn't doing it because they were all planning to break their treaties with us in those secret research centers. He was concerned about our safety. In fact, he was so concerned about our safety and the safety of Russians in general that a couple months after this, he issued what was called the Decree on the Closed Territories, which meant that any place in the Soviet Union where weapons of mass destruction are being produced or stored, any place where nuclear materials are being handled, are off limits to tourists, to Russian citizens, to anyone who doesn't have a special military reason to be there. It turns out that these closed territories encompass a vast, vast area, and most of the Gulag camps that I mentioned earlier are located within this area that foreigners and reporters and others cannot visit. Now, what about the KGB itself? I mean, how has the KGB fared during the changes in Russia? And here, this is a typical article. There are many like it. Mark Ullman reveals that the former Soviet intelligence service has not been much inconvenienced by the collapse of Soviet power. Why is this not surprising? It's not surprising because the KGB, being the father of lies and the creator and inventor of these deceptions and the executor of the plan, has to stay in operation, has to double in size, as Abraham Shifrin said. But, you know, a deceiver will never lack for dupes, is what Machiavelli said, and sometimes it's just too funny to keep the better jokes to yourself. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that in the Central Committee in the Kremlin, they howl with laughter at our political wizards. And sometimes, you got to admit, it's funny. Boris Yeltsin, the great Democrat, the great hero, a man with cirrhosis of the liver, and maybe he can't walk without stumbling, but he sure can crack a joke. And his joke at this moment was that he was going to use Russia's intercontinental ballistic missiles as a humanitarian force. They were going to load the warheads with food and medicine. And wherever in the world there was plague or famine, they would shoot the rocket up, and the warhead would detach and come down and parachute down, and there it would be, food and medicine for those poor people. Outrageous. I'm sure that we wouldn't need civil defense for those kind of rockets. Boris Yeltsin came to power, and the Soviet Union supposedly collapsed because of this August 1991 coup. President Gamskirtia of Georgia, who was very independent-minded fellow, declared after the coup, he said it was just a fabrication, it's just a trick to fool the West. Gorbachev himself was behind the coup. Well, Arnold Beichmann, a Sovietologist who does not like Golitsyn, does not believe in what Sena had to say about a long-range strategy, nonetheless found the coup curious. And here it is. Study delves into mysteries of Soviet coup. One of the biggest mysteries was that the coup plotters, when they had Gorbachev and the other Democrats blockaded in the White House in Moscow, was why they didn't cut off the electricity and stop the phones from operating and the fax machines from operating. Why didn't they turn off the hot and cold running water? In fact, when the heroic Boris got hungry, he and his fellow Democrats ordered out a pizza. And the coup plotters didn't even stop the pizza man from delivering. So yeah, Arnold Beichmann, he has a little bit of common sense. He can see that much. Now what about this tremendous revolution in Russia? What happened in all those 15 republics that made up the Soviet Union that are now sovereign states, each one of them, by the way, with a vote in the UN? Well, Kyrgyzstan, Azar Akiev and Apis Jugmagulov, they were Kyrgyzstan Communist Party Central Committee member and Premier of Kyrgyzstan SSR respectively. They were communist bosses. The heads of the country now, the great Democrats that lead it now, are communist bosses. Well, it gets better. Valdis Burkas and Anatolis Garbanovs, Communist Party Secretary and Latvian Communist Party Secretary for Ideology. The big kahunas of Marxism-Leninism in that country are now the big Democrats of that country. Then Lithuania, Algirdas Brazauskas, first secretary of the Lithuanian Communist Party, the top Communist Party guy. Moldavia, Marcia Snigur, Communist Party Soviet Union Central Committee member and Communist Party First Secretary of Moldavia, SSR. In Russia, Boris Yeltsin was a non-voting Communist Party Soviet Union Politburo member. Now Boris, if we are to believe his transformation, he is a kind of fluke of nature. How many men at the age of 60 turn against everything they fought for and stood for their entire lives? It can happen, but it's not likely. And then Tajikistan, Rakhman Nabiev, Tajik Communist Party boss. Turkmenistan, Saparamat Niyazov, first secretary of the Turkmen Communist Party. Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov, Communist Party first secretary of Uzbekistan. And this one's even better. Azerbaijan, KGB General Gaidar Aliyev. He was also first secretary of the Communist Party of his republic. He's an enterprising fellow. Not only was he a Communist Party boss, he was a KGB general. And he was a very close friend and colleague of the late Yuri Andropov, longtime head of the KGB. In Armenia, Levon Ter-Petrosyan, he's a KGB-controlled nationalist leader, much like Lech Walesa in Poland. This is one of those controlled dissidents. In Belarus, these two clowns, Alexander Lukashenko and Vyacheslav Kabik, Communist Party Soviet Union Central Committee members, and they are opposed to this day to the breakup of the USSR. They want the USSR to come back together. And they're open about it. And in Estonia, Leonard Meri, now if he's not a secret KGB agent, and I don't have any specific evidence that he is, he may be the real thing, but tiny little Estonia, hey, maybe we'll let Estonia just be free for a few years. We'll write all their names down and arrest them later. Then we get down to Georgia. MVD General Edward Shevardnadze, famous, we know from prisoners there, things smuggled out, that he has, over the years, personally supervised the torturing of political prisoners in Georgia. Claims to be now a convert to Christianity. Claims to be a Democrat. No, he's a brutal police thug. And he was a USSR Politburo member under Gorbachev, Georgian Communist Party First Secretary, and non-voting member of Brezhnev's Politburo. He was also Gorbachev's foreign minister. Now we move down to Kazakhstan. There's Sultan Nazarbayev, USSR Politburo member under Gorbachev, Kazakh Communist Party First Secretary, and President of Kazakhstan SSR. He's the same guy who was president of that country under communism. Same guy. Now, I skipped the Ukraine. The fellow heading the Ukraine was the boss at a communist missile factory. I'm sure they put a lot of Democrats in charge of their missile and atom bomb manufacturing. Now, what other information do we have about the changes in Russia that cast aspersions on their sincerity? This courageous woman, Yevgenia Albats, wrote this book a few years ago called The KGB. Called The State Within a State, the KGB and its hold on Russia, past, present, and future. In this book, she outlines the deceptive nature of the changes in Russia. How after the '91 coup, when Yeltsin took charge, people were more guarded in their phone conversations. There was more of a sense of the police looking over people's shoulders. She even writes that at Moscow News, where she was a reporter, they hired KGB agents, put them in the newsroom where they could look over her shoulder. You see, she was the reporter who exposed the information that the $1.5 billion given by the West for Russia to disarm its nuclear warheads was used to build a chemical weapons plant in violation of the treaty they signed with George Bush. So obviously they want a KGB agent to be in the newsroom. They'd want to find out who was leaking that information to her. Here's what she writes in her book. There had never been any real question of disbanding the Committee for State Security, KGB. Oh, a bit of patching had to be done, not so much for the benefit of the Russian public, which was much too busy looking for bread, that hungry autumn there wasn't a loaf left by noon, as to dazzle the West. And it worked. You see, you get the tune? It's a carefully staged play. The purpose is to dazzle the West. Boris Yeltsin has cirrhosis of the liver because, like many actors, he has a drinking problem. He is not the head of the USSR or Russia, or the Russian Republic rather. He is up there to play a role. Another Russian wrote an interesting book. He wrote another book I'll tell you about too. Andrei Navrazov. I've had the pleasure of speaking with him. And this book, The Coming Order, outlines the whole idea of the deception to get the West to disarm. Andrei's father, Lev Navrazov, was Stalin's favorite translator from English to Russian. So Andrei grew up in a privileged home. In the neighborhood that he lived, Andrei Gromyko, the longtime foreign minister, lived there. He had all kinds of bigwigs at his home. They'd talk around the kitchen table, and he said that as a boy, he heard talk of this democratization of Russia in the future. He heard them discussing it. And when he was, it was interesting, he came to this country when he was about a high school senior age, and he went to a private school, I think it was back east, and one of the young American boys there said, in America, we have something called the freedom of, the pursuit of happiness. And Andrei looked at him and said, well, in the Soviet Union, we have something called the hydrogen bomb. And that about sums up the essential cultural difference here, the difference in perspective. Andrei writes in his book, The Gingerbread Race, about the Western elite, Skull and Bones, all those folks, the New World Order crowd. And what he says is they're like the gingerbread man. They have all this money, this technology, and all this arrogance that goes with it. And they believe that no one can catch them, that the dictatorships in the East can't possibly match wits with them or match guns with them. Well, he said, like the gingerbread man, they're going to climb onto the nose of the fox. See, run as fast as you can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man. It doesn't work, because eventually the fox is there and he gets you to go up on his nose to cross the river and he gobbles you up. And that's what Andrei says is going to happen to the West and to Skull and Bones and the New World Order. It's food for the communists, who are much more sophisticated in their preparations. Andrei Navrazov writes in The Coming Order, the bitter truth before us then is that the free Soviet press has been allowed to focus on internal failure, that is in Russia, because this justifies the new course of super détente. It has done a good job not because the KGB managed the deception from one day to the next, but because the Soviet civilian economy has been in a state of collapse since 1917, just as the Soviet strategic infrastructure has prospered since 1917 and, since 1963, achieved nuclear parity with and then superiority over its NATO adversary. The current transfer of science and technology will render that superiority irreversible. That is the sad truth, ladies and gentlemen, of what's going on today, and Andre put it very succinctly. And here's one of the categories of weaponry that they are preparing in. We signed a treaty with them to get rid of chemical weapons. They're one of the three main weapons of mass destruction. There's biological, there's chemical, there's nuclear. Well, here's the chemical. And what did they do to circumvent the treaty they signed with George Bush? Besides using the money earmarked for nuclear weapons to build a chemical weapons factory, they've developed a new kind of chemical weapon, A232. It's binary. That means that it consists of two elements, each one harmless on its own. But when you bring them together, they're as lethal, it is as lethal as VX gas, one of the most lethal nerve agents known, which is in itself many times more lethal than sarin gas. Now, why did they make it in this form? Why make it in binary form? Because you see, they can get around the arms control inspections that way. They can create it as if it were an industrial chemical, stockpile it, warehouse it with industrial chemicals. And the inspectors will go, oh no, there's no poison gas there, that's just an industrial chemical. It's a witting attempt to fool us, to deceive us in a very crucial area. What about biological weapons? U.S. asked Russia to show it has halted on its biological warfare program, military suspected of treaty violations. Some of you may have remembered that when Boris Yeltsin first took control in Russia, he came over to America, and Barbara Walters interviewed him. Now, Boris Yeltsin's from Sverdlovsk in Russia. That's where he was party boss at first. And Sverdlovsk happens to be the center of anthrax manufacturing in the Soviet Union. In fact, in 1979, they had an accident there, 7 years after the 1972 protocol prohibiting the manufacturing of biological weapons. An anthrax factory had an explosion, and a huge cloud of the stuff was released. Lucky for Sverdlovsk, the wind was blowing away from the town, and only 1,000 or 2,000 people died in the countryside instead of hundreds of thousands of people in the city. Now, Barbara Walters had done her homework. She knew that Yeltsin was from Sverdlovsk. She knew that there was no evidence that they'd stop this again, so she confronted him. And she said, Mr. Yeltsin, you're still making these biological weapons. What are you going to do about it? And Yeltsin said, I'm going to go back and fix it. You know, we're not going to do this anymore. Well, several months later, Marshal Shaposhnikov, the head of the Commonwealth of Independent States military, was confronted by a Western journalist who said, Boris Yeltsin did not keep his promise. You are still making this dangerous biological material. And Shaposhnikov, in the spirit of the new Russia, said, yes, you're right. Those dirty rats down there, they're renegades. They're not following orders. We're trying to control the situation, but we're going to have to be firmer. Of course, every 6 months, it's the same cycle. And defectors come out telling us that they are working on a super plague virus, something that's immune to any kind of treatment, that instead of having to breathe 8,000 spores to become infected, only a few dozen spores will cause infection. When you prepare for nuclear war, as Marshal Sokolovsky and his theorists pointed out, you have to build underground, because everything on the surface of the earth is vulnerable to these massive nuclear weapons that we have today. Here we have the story from the Orange County Register. Russia constructs vast underground complex in Urals. Now that's just April of last year. They are building a city under Yamato Mountain the size of metropolitan Washington. And it is riddled with rail and road tunnels. Why? Why is it riddled? Because Russia has been producing these new road and rail mobile ICBMs. And they can hide hundreds of these things underground in these tunnels and in this underground city. They also will not allow any Western arms control inspectors or officials to go down there to see what they are doing. They could be breaking any treaty. Imagine signing a treaty with someone and saying, oh, well, you can't look there to see if we're cheating. They're cheating, ladies and gentlemen. Just like they cheated on the chemical weapons, they're cheating on the nuclear weapons too, and on the biological weapons. And Yamato Mountain is all part of it. One of the other reasons that mobile ICBM launchers are significant, you may remember at the beginning of the Gulf War, our intelligence thought Saddam Hussein only had about 50 Scud mobile missile launchers. You know, all the satellites that we have and all the reconnaissance planes, and that's the best we could do. It turns out he had 250 or more mobile launchers. But because these things are so difficult to keep track of, even by the sophisticated space intelligence systems we have today, we underestimated him by a factor of 5. Now the same thing goes for the Soviets. Only they have a territory, the former Soviet Union's territory, is 50 times larger than Saddam Hussein's territory. That's 50 times the space into which to hide these mobile launchers. It's not just Yamato Mountain, though. Russia is riddled with nuclear-proof towns, bunkers, cities, and tunnels. In 1955, the Supreme Soviet passed a law saying that all new places of work, all new residences, that is apartment buildings, had to have not only a fallout shelter, but a shelter with blast doors and tunnels leading to the subway system or other communication systems and to where the water and food was being stockpiled. And as for food, you probably read in the papers how they've had a bad harvest this year and they're begging the world for help. The fact of the matter is, a couple of years ago in the Wall Street Journal, it was published that the former Soviet republics have 362 million metric tons of grain stockpiled in these underground nuclear-proof bunkers, towns, and cities. That is enough to feed the population of the former Soviet Union for 3 to 5 years. And that does not include the tens of millions of metric tons put away for the Soviet Army. Now here's another article from last year on this same, this one wants to slide, same subject. Moscow still building nuclear defenses. Under the Remenki district in Moscow, they're building a new nuclear-proof town. Now, this goes right into ABM defense. William T. Lee, recently an official with the Defense Intelligence Agency, has made the statement. In fact, he wrote a book. In the book review I read recently on the internet, he wrote a book on the ABM treaty fraud. And he said that the Russians currently deploy 10 to 12,000 anti-ballistic missiles around their country with 18 battle management radars. Now this is fantastic. How did they get away with this? What they did is they made their anti-ballistic missiles look like surface-to-air missiles. When the CIA first noticed them deploying these things many years ago, they did a study to determine what kind of missiles they really were. And the CIA, of course, as always, erred. They decided that they were only surface-to-air missiles, not ABMs. And the fact of the matter is that Lee has found evidence to prove that they are, after all, ABMs. Now, why doesn't this surprise us? They cheat on the biological weapons treaty. They cheat on the chemical weapons treaty. Why not on the ABM treaty? In fact, the START treaty, START stands for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START 1, they have told President Clinton that they will not meet the 2003 deadline for when they have to have their arsenals built down to like a 2/3 level. Okay? Well, the United States is ahead of that program. We're already practically there. Well, when President Clinton heard this, that they weren't going to be able to make the deadline, he said, okay, you got 4 more years. Take your time. Now they can just, with the kind of leadership we've got now, they can just violate right out there in the open. Now, besides from all this cheating, there's also some stealing going on. You know, you can, what is the saying? You can lock your door against a thief, but you can't lock your door against a liar. U.S.-built computer missing in Russia. Perhaps you read in the paper recently the Cox Committee has found that Clinton has been giving supercomputers to China. Well, apparently they've been giving them to Russia too. And what else? What better to make nuclear weapons with or to hone those 18 battle management radars? But it doesn't end there. Russians cling to dream of nuclear earthquake weapon. That's bizarre, isn't it? They've got all these nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Why do they need an earthquake weapon? Well, it's pretty simple, ladies and gentlemen. See, the United States has a few deep bunkers and tunnels, too. Not very many, certainly not enough to put the whole population of the United States underground, like the Russians can do with their urban population. But we do have some places they can't get at rather easily that are tunneled down. And what better way to get at those places than with an earthquake weapon? You see, they've covered all the bases. When I was with Stanislav Lunev a few weeks ago in Washington, he pointed out to me that they have a weapon more sophisticated than this one. This one is you explode a nuclear bomb on a fault line and it triggers a earthquake down the fault line some days or hours later. He said they've got something that emits some kind of a frequency wave of some kind, like a Tesla weapon. You put it down on the ground and it emits these waves through the Earth's crust and can trigger earthquakes. Now, he didn't know a lot of specifics on it and he couldn't really comment on it. He just heard about it. Now, are the Russians our buddies? Do they love us? Do they hate us? Do they dream of wiping us out? Here's evidence of their hostility. This happened last year. This is from Bill Gertz's column in the Washington Times. Russian laser burns U.S. officer. Maybe some of you remember reading about this. There was an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine leaving our port up there in Washington, and following close behind it was a little Russian fishing boat. And that little Russian fishing boat had a whole mass of antennas sticking out of it. And a Canadian helicopter thought this was rather intriguing. So the Canadian helicopter, with an American naval officer on board, decided to get up close and take some photographs of the antenna array on this fishing boat, this Russian fishing boat. Well, the fishing boat fired a laser beam at the Navy helicopter and blinded two naval officers, one Canadian and one American. If it had blinded the pilot, the helicopter would have crashed. Now that's hostility. What happened? The Navy forced the boat, the Russian boat, into Tacoma and was going to search it, but the Clinton administration objected to a rigorous search of the vessel. Eventually, the boat was allowed to go. There is drunken Boris, able to crack another joke at our expense. He says, it says, Yeltsin says Russia to halt production of nuclear subs. There's a great promise. Hey, did they keep it? Let's look. 3 years later, August of 1995, Boris made that promise in 92. 3 years later, it says here that Russia is continuing to produce nuclear submarines at the same rate as they did during the Soviet era. In fact, they are modernizing their submarines and making them qualitatively superior. I'll just give you an idea of their superiority in one class of submarines. Today we have 18 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. That's our ballistic missile submarine fleet. They have 42 to our 18, almost 3 times the number. Now granted, ours are better, except that if they attack us first, they might get some of our better submarines, especially when they're in port or in their submarine bunkers. But 42 to 18, that is astonishing for a country whose leader has recently promised an end to the production of submarines. And here's from the London Times. New Russian subs outsmart Royal Navy. The British are getting afraid. They're worried. These Russian submarines are hard to track. The new Akulas, when they tested them a year ago last summer under the thermal layer, they could not be detected. This makes them as formidable as our Los Angeles class. Now there was something I got to back up a bit. It's kind of interesting. We passed over it. Here we're back to drunken Boris again. Now notice, underneath, there's another article. It says, attorney says Honecker double used in court. What's this? Erich Honecker was the dictator of communist East Germany. And when East Germany collapsed and went into West Germany, they arrested him. And they charged him with manslaughter for those people who fled across the Berlin Wall. Well, it's kind of interesting. According to this article, one of the prosecuting attorneys stood up in court and pointed at Erich Honecker and said, "That's not Erich Honecker. That is a double." And a week, 2 weeks, 10 days later, they dismissed the case for reasons of health, because Honecker was suffering from cancer. It's very interesting indeed, these tricks that are constantly being played on us. Now we get back to China and the one clenched fist and the Sino-Russian alliance. China builds nukes that put U.S. at risk. The Chinese are aiming, according to a recent CIA report, most of their nuclear missiles and bombs at us, their trading partner. They want to blow up their best customer. You know, then what would happen? You couldn't go to Lecter's and get that electric toaster that you like so much at such a low price, made from gulag labor. No, the Chinese have been in cahoots with the Russians since the beginning. When I was with Colonel Lunev again, he emphasized to me that the Chinese strategic rocket forces are completely a creation of the Russian military-industrial complex. And that's just the beginning. In fact, this month or next month, they are sending an aircraft carrier. The Russians are giving an aircraft carrier to China. What great buddies. And as I mentioned before, they are sharing intelligence at all levels. The new Prime Minister of Russia, Yevgeny Primakov. This little item came when he was appointed foreign minister. Before that, he was the head of the foreign intelligence part of the KGB. In other words, he's a KGB general. The country's being run by a KGB general. I mean, the government's being run by a KGB general. And what is so special about him? What is so significant in terms of what's about to happen? He speaks fluent Arabic, and he's close friends with Saddam Hussein. And when he was foreign minister, he spent a lot of time flying between Iraq, Iran, and Syria, forming up an alliance to destroy Israel. Now, it's very sinister that he has been made head of the government, because it's the green light to those radical Arab and Muslim states that your man is now in charge over in Russia. And we're going to back you now 100%. You can count on us. And you can see how the situation is heated up in Afghanistan. The Russians, you see, they never really got out of Afghanistan. In the 80s, they inserted an Uzbek corps under command of Abdul Rashid Dostum. And they stayed behind when the Soviets pulled out. They declared themselves first mercenaries, then Islamic. And they kept fighting against the holy warriors, the Islamic warriors in Iran. Now that they've started to lose, despite support from Soviet-built bombers in Tajikistan, they're calling in the Iranians. Iran has massed combat brigades on the Afghan border. And Russia, according to Colonel Lunev, is creating 2 new military districts that stare down on the Middle East area. The Volga and the Urals military districts are being split. That is, they're making carving new ones out of those. Now, when you create a military district, you set up the staff, the generals, the officers, for entire armies. To create new military districts there suggests the intention of deploying large armies into South Asia and the Middle East. Now, one last interesting comment. This is what made me head for the hills. Russia's nuclear weapons are on permanent alert. It's from a year ago last summer, the Orange County Register. And what it basically says is that because Russia's spy satellites don't work anymore, and since they can't see our missile bases, the activity there, whether or not we're bringing our missiles up to a higher state of readiness, they've got to keep their missiles at a high state of readiness all the time. They've got to be ready to launch in a moment's notice, because they can't see whether we're getting ready to launch. In an era in which the Cold War is supposedly over, they're afraid of us launching a surprise nuclear strike against them, and they're so afraid they're willing to put their entire arsenal on a hair trigger? You see, if you're going to launch a surprise attack on the United States, you have to bring your missiles up to a higher state of readiness. And you have to have a plausible excuse for doing so. Because normally during the Cold War, if the Russians brought their missiles up to a higher state of alert, we would match it, because we would not want to be caught off guard. You can't just push a button and make these rockets go up. They're spaceships. They leave the Earth's atmosphere. They travel through space. They have heat shields on them to re-enter the atmosphere and hit their targets. They're very sophisticated weapons. You have to make certain preparations to get them to launch. And this is what they have done. And we have bought the excuse, the lame excuse for getting this thing ready. It is an extremely dangerous situation, ladies and gentlemen. And I think that we should look around at our country and enjoy what we have while we have it, because we may not have it for that much longer. Those people over there have dug out shelters. They've created a vast ABM system. And not only that, next month they are launching a very bizarre satellite, a satellite that supposedly can reflect an energy source 10 times brighter than the full moon. The reason, here again, it's like the Mercy missiles. The reason for this energy source is to substitute for street lamps in cities in Siberia. It's a light source. But what's really interesting about this light source is that if the satellite launch is a success, if the test works, they're going to launch hundreds of these things. Now here's a country that can't afford to put up street lamps, but it can put up hundreds of satellites to substitute for them. I would say we have another problem here, ladies and gentlemen. They're probably about to deploy their own SDI. And those satellites may be directed energy weapons. I don't know that for sure, but their behavior, the pattern of Russian deception and behavior, raises my suspicions. Well, what we come to now is the Soviet nuclear offensive. Okay, the deception strategy has played itself out. We have disarmed ourselves. We are in a position of vulnerability. They are in a position of nuclear superiority. Now, how do they use that nuclear superiority? What is it that they're able to do with it? And here we come into what the Russian generals themselves have said in their many works. At home I have the Russian Officers' Library, which has been translated by the United States Air Force. And it tells us what they think. This is a representative book. This is by an American analyst who goes over what they say. Joseph D. Douglas Jr. wrote this. It's the Soviet nuclear offensive. But let's look at what some of the generals have said about a nuclear war. There is profound error and harm in the disoriented claims of bourgeois ideologues that there will be no victor in a thermonuclear war. This is what we believe in America, that you can't win a nuclear war, that nuclear superiority is meaningless because we have enough nuclear weapons to kill everyone on the planet many, many times over. Well, it so happens that that sharp knife in your kitchen could slit every throat on Earth many, many times over. But everyone has to bare their throat. The fact of the matter is that there are, in countries like Russia and China, underground bunkers. 1,000 feet down, you can't destroy that with a nuclear weapon. There are anti-ballistic missiles. There may be particle beam weapons that can stop some of these. And then there's also taking the hits. It's been estimated that a full-blown attack on America, you know, you could have 100 million or 60 million or 30 million people survive. You still would have a country. You still would have a world afterwards. Besides, these weapons are not made to wipe out all life on Earth. They are made to gain a military victory. And in the hands of generals, that's how they would be used. Generals are not exterminators. You don't fight a war just to kill all the enemy soldiers or population. You fight a war to conquer the enemy country. Now here's another quote. The assertion that nuclear war will not be a continuation of politics is completely fallacious. That's General Jareve. Okay? Clausewitz said that war is politics by other means, by violent means, a continuation of politics. And that doesn't change with nuclear weapons. So you have a bigger bomb, you kill a lot of people, or you blow up you make some big smoking holes in the ground. It's still war, and it still accomplishes your goal. In fact, there's a seductive element here, because you could, if you wanted to, change the map. You could change the population density of areas, the amount of people who speak a certain language. You could force people to immigrate out of certain regions. It's got real possibilities in terms of changing things around. The armed forces of the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries must be prepared above all to wage war under conditions of the mass use of nuclear weapons. Very typical statement. How many of you have heard an American general make a similar statement? You won't. It's politically inexpedient here. You won't hear them say it. This is volume 2 of Peter Vincent Pry's 1992 work, The Strategic Nuclear Balance and Why It Matters. Or Why It Matters is volume 1. This is Nuclear Wars, Exchanges, and Outcomes. Pry goes right to this question of whether or not it matters if country A has so many thousands more nuclear warheads than country B. And he says, yes, it matters very much. And he explains the mechanics of nuclear war, how you fight one, how you go about winning one, from the perspective of an American analyst. And he's aware of the Soviet literature. He's aware of what they are saying. And in this book, written in 1990, he uses the force levels that existed then. That is, the number of bombs and missiles we had then and that they had then. And what he says is that they had, in 1990, a decisive advantage. They had nuclear superiority over us. Okay? They had an advantage, but could that be translated into a meaningful military victory? Now, his book, his whole analysis could be reduced to this chart. Now, I'll go over the cones, starting with the blue cone. The blue cone, which measures 400 estimated megatonnage, that would be the necessary response by the United States to fulfill the mission of mutual assured destruction. Okay? In the 1960s, the Pentagon determined that if we could hit Russia back with 400 megatons after they hit us, that would be unacceptable to them, because it would effectively kill 25% of Russia's population and 75% of their industry, at least at that time. Now, at that time, they did not have the extensive underground sheltering that they have today. And so some experts estimate that at best we could kill 11% of their population, which would be comparable, which would actually be less than what they lost in World War II, like fighting Hitler. They won World War II, losing about 30 million people, and 27 to 30 million people, and they could win World War III doing the same. But that's mutual assured destruction. You know, minimum, we got to hit them back with 400 megatons. Now, when Peter Vincent Pry goes through the models of war and how they would begin, he has a best case, worst case, and moderate case. And that's what the red cone is. The red cone is what he sees as our best case in 1990. If the Russian surprise attacked us, he felt the best case we'd be able to shoot back with 308 megatons, which is more than 90 less than what you need for mutual assured destruction. The moderate case, it's less than 100, and the little yellow splotch there is worst case. We don't have anything to fire back with. They get us in one sweep. Now, how does this nuclear surprise attack work? How do the Russians achieve it? Besides the deception strategy, what are the technical particulars? The main thing is through microwave weapons, electromagnetic pulse, and the use of submarines near targets. I mean, a submarine missile rises from the sea. The submarine could be positioned right near the target if it's a coastal target, and it would hit the target before anyone could physically do anything. It would just be a matter of seconds. That's all the warning you would have. So, but the main thing is to create this confusion, 30 minutes, 30, 40 minutes of confusion through attacking early warning systems, through microwave weapons, electromagnetic pulse, and anti-satellite weapons. You blind the satellites. A directed energy weapon might be able to fulfill this goal. Now, it's interesting, 30 or 40 minutes of confusion. I would suggest to you that we have had 6 years of confusion in this country, and that our current president has put his exclamation point on this confusion with his recent remaking of our nuclear policy, that we will only launch a nuclear strike when our ground sensors detect the explosions actually occurring on our soil. Now, in a coordinated attack, this would be disastrous because the Soviets could time their missile strikes so that they would land at once. And once they've landed on our missile silos, on our submarine bunkers, on our strategic bomber bases, and our nuclear weapons storage facilities, it's too late. And this is what Pry assumes. He says, look, we just don't have the infrastructure to avoid the confusion at the outset of a nuclear attack. We're going to lose, he says, there's no way. We're going to lose all our ICBMs, the ground-based ones. We're going to lose our submarine bunkers and the submarines that happen to be in port. We're going to lose our SAC bases, and anything that gets out of those SAC bases is going to be shot down by that huge missile array that they have around their country and whatever other defensive weapons they have. And so what Pry says is the red cone. See, that red cone is if every one of our ballistic missile submarines on patrol is able to fire back. Okay? That's what the red cone is. And it's less than the 400 estimated megatonnage of mutual assured destruction. Because you see, of our 18 Ohio class, for example, that we have now, 6 to 9 of them are in port or in bunkers at any one time being refitted. Only half to a third of them are at sea. So you see, that takes care of quite a few of that force. But this is if all the ones at sea survived. Now the green cone is if they can get some of our ballistic missile submarines. And of course, the yellow one is if they can get all of them. Now Pry suggests, he suspects they might be able to get at least where the green cone is. Because there is a technique for attacking ballistic missile submarines successfully. And he goes through it in his book, and it's not something classified. It's something that anybody can figure out, and the Russians have known this for some time. How many of you know that a ballistic missile submarine, when it moves, no matter how deep under the water it is, it leaves a wake on the surface? Now that wake doesn't show you exactly where the submarine is, because the wake actually is way behind the submarine. But it gives you an approximate idea of the location of the submarine. Now these wakes that these submarines, when they're way under the water and when they move, they create on the surface, it turns out that there may be satellite technology that can detect these wakes. And the Russians may have this technology. Now, that does you no good if you want to launch a depth charge or a torpedo attack on the submarine, because it's much too imprecise. The submarine could be some miles away from this wake. However, if you use ICBMs, if the Russians use their nuclear missiles as depth charges, a 1 megaton charge or greater exploded in the approximate vicinity of the submarine. It is estimated the shock wave that it would create would crush the hulls of all submarines within 18 kilometers of the blast. Now Pry goes over this, and I forget what the exact megatonnage of the warhead would be. I'm not sure it matters. They could also sprinkle the area with a MIRV warhead and cause this destruction. So it is possible to attack our ballistic missile submarines by this more indirect method. It's rather unconventional, but it is known. So the idea that these submarines are invulnerable is not absolutely true. Now this is what Pry says about the 3 scenarios in his book. He says, in all 3 scenarios, worst, moderate, and best cases, judging from military outcomes, a nuclear war would probably result in a U.S. surrender. An unconditional surrender cannot be ruled out and may even be likely in the worst and moderate cases. Then he continues, the USSR's post-exchange strategic advantage probably would enable it to continue fighting a nuclear war. The United States, having lost or spent all of its nuclear forces, would be reduced to resisting with conventional weapons. The West must lose. Now, nuclear war for the Russians, when I was with Colonel Lunev, he said something interesting. He said, you know, with the Russian General Staff, a nuclear war is not just simply an exchange of nuclear weapons. It doesn't end there. And of course, this is what books like Soviet Military Strategy are about. They're about how you send motorized rifle divisions and parachute divisions into the enemy's country. And they make rapid advances, and they go to capture strategic locations. You don't destroy all the targets with nuclear weapons. You leave less strategic targets for the tanks and artillery and conventional aircraft to take out. And so it's an invasion. It's a total attack, a nuclear blitzkrieg with all the elements of the World War II conventional weapons backing up the nuclear missiles. And I will get into that in a bit. But some of you may have some real doubts that this nuclear war thing is realistic, because you've heard about nuclear winter and you've heard about fallout destroying all of the survivors. So I want to discuss these doomsday scenarios, these end-of-the-world kind of idea about nuclear weapons, and show you what a fiction it is. This is from Pry's book. He says, subsequent analysis of TTAPS. TTAPS was the study that came up with this nuclear winter idea, and the S in TTAPS is Sagan. The letters represent the initials of the scientists' names. Subsequent analysis of TTAPS have not supported its findings. Russell Seitz of Harvard University's Center for International Affairs has traced the history of nuclear winter research and found that the trend has been, as climatological models have improved, to predict less severe nuclear winter effects, and finally to discredit the phenomenon altogether. Now, he talks about another source, Starley Thompson and Stephen Schneider, the authors of the NCAR study on nuclear winter, wrote the epitaph for this latest apocalyptic theory in the summer 1986 issue of Foreign Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, to create a nuclear winter effect that they're talking about, you would need a hydrogen bomb the size of the Empire State Building with more nuclear weapons-grade material in it than exists on the entire planet Earth, and it would cost more than the gross domestic product of all the countries of the Earth put together to build it. Nobody would ever have any reason for building such a weapon. And nuclear winter is not a real threat. Now let's talk about fallout. There are two kinds of fallout, long-term and short-term. You've all heard about the long-term kind. That's the real scary fallout. Those are those particles like cesium-137 and strontium-90 that stay around, have a half-life of 1,000 years or so, that stay around a long time and can get into the food chain and can cause all kinds of damage. Well, I've got news for you. These particles have been around us for generations. What a nuclear war does is it adds more to the mix. It adds more of these particles in. In fact, those old bombs that we used to blow up before the hydrogen bomb was invented, they were fission bombs. They were not very efficient in burning up all their fuel, and they were very dirty in terms of these long-lived isotopes. In fact, in the studies that I've read, from the above-ground nuclear testing of fission bombs, there has been more of these contaminants, these isotopes, long-term, put into the atmosphere than would be put into the atmosphere from a full-blown hydrogen bomb war. Now, I'll give you an idea. Yes, leukemias and cancers went up in the 50s and 60s. Because there were more of these particles floating around, people breathed them or got them into their food, and they did develop cancers from it. But it's very rare. It's unlikely that you will pick up one of these particles because they get so spread out. And your body has to go through a process to absorb them. Now, the Australian government did a study on what the long-term fallout hazard would be for the Australian population. And the study was rather shocking. They found that after a general nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere, worst case, and of course these long-term particles would go all over the world, it determined that the cancer rate in Australia would go down, not up. Now, of course, there would be an increase in leukemias and lung cancers, a slight increase from the fallout, from the long-term fallout. But there would be a huge decrease in cancers because the importation of tobacco from America would be curtailed as a result of America being bombed. So that gives you an idea of really what the long-term impact of these isotopes are. Now, you don't want to eat food from a ground zero impact crater, you know, and you don't want to graze cattle there. You know, you're going to have to be a little bit careful about some of the areas that these long-term contaminants will be in. But overall, it is you can cope. The survivors can cope with this hazard, just as we cope with many pollutants and hazards today. The real danger of large-scale extermination comes from short-term fallout. Now, it says here that this is a misleading fallout map. It turns out that all fallout maps that you will see or have seen are misleading except for one. And the only fallout map that is not misleading is the fallout map that is drawn up from looking at the Russian war plan. Because this short-term fallout is created only by ground-bursting nuclear weapons. If you air-burst the weapon, there is no short-term fallout created. Now, the short-term fallout, what happens is the fireball of a hydrogen bomb is 10 times hotter than the surface of the sun when it first ignites. And if it ignites at ground level, the particles, the matter it comes in contact with, it alters it, and it makes it radioactive. And as the fireball carries this up, you know, heat rises, and the fireball rises, the wind blows it downwind, and that dust from that fireball, it settles downwind. And it is very hot. The levels of contamination from this dust, well, 450 rentigens is a lethal dose in a 24-hour period. Now, you could survive that dosage, but it would take you 6 months to convalesce from it. But we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of rentigens an hour in terms of exposure of anyone above ground in this kind of intensive fallout immediately downwind of a ground burst. Now, let me show you what the United States would be hit with if every single political and military target in the USA were hit at ground level. Pretty bad, huh? Most of the eastern part of the country would be a desert. These radiation levels are so intense they would kill most plants. Now, the state of Maine and upper New York would be spared, parts of the Carolinas and Virginia, and parts of the South and Florida, and larger sections of the western United States would be spared. But let me tell you something. The Russians would not use their weapons in this manner. And there's a number of reasons they would not, very practical reasons. First, this is ground bursting the weapon. You get a less chance for a direct hit on a time-sensitive target like a missile silo. See, guys in missile silos won't be killed by fallout. It doesn't matter. You can generate as much fallout as you want over our missile silos. The guys down there are underground, and they'll be okay. You got to get a direct hit. And what Peter Price says is that actually, with the new guidance systems, the rockets are so accurate that the best chance of the hit on a nuclear missile silo is to actually airburst the missile above the silo. That gives the best chance for a hit. Now, this is contrary to what most experts have been told and believed in this field for a while, and people who have not kept up on the literature don't realize this is the case. Now, there is a very important reason why the Russians would not want a ground burst as well as the accuracy reason on the missile silos. You see, rockets are not 100% accurate. They're only 70 to 80% on their chance of hitting the target. And so you want to chase down each target with more than one rocket, but you know, you've got a limited supply of these rockets. You don't want to overdo it. So what you do is you send your bomber pilots in, and they can visually spot which targets have been taken out and which haven't. But you see, look at these clouds of radiation. 2,000 or more rentigens an hour. A bomber pilot flying through those clouds through the Dakotas, he would be killed within 30 minutes of contacting one of those clouds. He would start to lose motor function, perhaps within 7, 8, 9 minutes of flying through this cloud. He might not be able to deliver his target. He certainly would not make it back to Russia alive. Now, they do not want to lose valuable bombers or bomber pilots running them through these radioactive clouds. And they have to send their bombers to make sure they've gotten everything. So that is a very practical reason they will not do this kind of an attack on the United States. The other reason is that making the entire eastern part of the United States into a desert might make the usefulness of the land not as great as it would otherwise be to them. The killing off of so many plants would cause changes in the soil, would cause a disastrous erosion in the ensuing rains, and it would be extremely expensive to try to replant and reforest all these areas. Now, there are certain targets they do have to ground burst attack, and those are things like the nuclear submarine bunkers, like off the Oakland Bay Bridge in the San Francisco Bay Area, nuclear weapon stockpiles. Now, they could drop paratroops on some of these places and capture them intact, but there are some of these targets that they do have to ground burst. Bremerton, Washington, San Diego, the Bay Area, and so you see these smaller clouds make more sense. And there will be some ground bursting in some of the, against some of the command bunkers. And things that are really deep down, remember, they have the earthquake weapon as well that they can use. If they wanted to kill us without killing all the plants and destroying the environment in the immediate area with the short-term fallout. Now, this short-term fallout goes away in 14 days, 13 to 18 days. So this fallout that I'm talking about does not last a long time like the long-lasting fallout. This stuff goes away, and your troops can go through it, and basically you're okay in it. This map here shows the areas that, given a ground bursting everywhere, the areas that would be safe. And of course, the only absolutely safe area is the double crosshatched area that is shown in Northern California and Southern Oregon. That's the only place that the wind patterns just won't blow any fallout into that area at all. You don't need a bomb shelter if you live there. But every other area, there are different probabilities. Wisconsin has some chance of missing some fallout. Same thing with some areas of Nevada and Utah. And you can see there's other little zones that have a chance of avoiding it. But so if you want to be 100% safe, you want to live where I live in Eureka, California. But if you can build some kind of shelter, emergency, or a small one, it's a good idea in the other areas of the country, because you don't know exactly, since you don't have the Russian war plan, you don't know exactly where the ground bursts are going to happen. Now, saying that, I want to mention biological attack. If they want to kill the population, rather than ground bursting and causing fallout to kill us, they'll use biological weapons. And the most effective kind of biological attack on America is called polar outbreak. Okay? And it would mainly affect the Great Plains area of the country, the area that's flat. Biological weapons don't work particularly well in mountainous areas or areas where you have unstable air movement. Now, polar outbreak happens in winter. It forms in northern Canada. It is a cold air mass about 1,000 miles in length, about 6,000 feet thick, and a few planes could seed this air mass with, let's say, anthrax. Okay? I think it's the most effective biological weapon because it can stay around for up to 60 days. This cloud within the cold air mass, the cold air mass moves at 20 to 25 miles an hour down onto the plains. Okay? And it basically fills up most of the eastern part of the country, east of the Rockies, and then it exits the eastern seaboard with 3,000 feet of thickness remaining. Now, it is believed that one of these attacks, a third of the people in the path of the polar outbreak cold front would inhale enough particles to become infected. And anthrax is highly fatal, pulmonary anthrax, the kind you breathe. The first symptom is you think you have a cold. On the second day, you may feel a little better. And on the third day, you die, typically. And your lungs fill with fluid. And if you don't suffocate, you burn up with the fever. Now, they could make a number of these passes in winter. The reason also that winter is the best time for one of these attacks is sunlight degrades the biological weapon. So colder weather, less sunlight is always better. Now, some details on the attack, the invasion of North America. The Russians and the Chinese have done some curious things. The Chinese in particular. Through front companies, the People's Liberation Army has attempted to establish itself in various ports, both on the Gulf Coast and on the west coast of the United States. Some of you have heard about the controversy now in Long Beach. The People's Liberation Army, through a front company, has been officially granted the right to control the port of Long Beach, but local citizens have protested, and it's going through a kind of litigation process now. But why Long Beach? Well, if you've ever been to Long Beach, California, you'll realize that it is the center of petroleum oil refining on the West Coast. And if you want to project military power, particularly tank and motorized rifle divisions, into the interior of North America, you need to capture these refineries intact if possible. Now, Panama Canal is an interesting thing. William Bright Marine, a Panamanian presidential candidate, recently publicized the event that the Chinese People's Liberation Army, through its front company, and also a front company it jointly owns with Chinese intelligence, managed to, through bribing Panamanian legislators, get this Panama Law No. 5 passed, which gives them control of the ports of entry on either side of the canal, and also promises to hand over to them the American military bases when we leave those military bases at the end of 1999. Now, it's most sinister. Why does China want to control the Panama Canal? Why does she want Long Beach? Why does she want certain strategic ports in the Gulf? I would suggest to you the model of Hitler's invasion of Norway. It's very interesting. When I met with Colonel Lunev, I got to ask him about the Norway invasion. Now, Colonel Lunev is very precise, and when you come to hear him speak, he will correct us all in our getting whatever it is wrong that he said. But one of the things I asked him was, when he studied in their war colleges, were they interested in the Norway operation that Hitler launched? And he said yes. And I asked him, I said, what was significant about the Norway operation? And he said, the Brandenburg Regiment. Well, what it was is that the Germans had pre-stockpiled, pre-positioned stockpiles of arms in Norway before the war. And then when they realized that they were going to invade Norway, they sent troops dressed as tourists into Norway. And these troops then rendezvoused at a given time to these secret arms caches, put on German uniforms, grabbed the weapons, and there you had a regiment on Norwegian soil. Like magic. No Normandy-style beach invasion, no bloody climbing up through the barbed wire, just right there behind enemy lines, a full-blown military unit. Now, the other thing the Norwegians did, the Germans did in Norway, was what was called the Trojan horse. General Fuller writes about it in his History of the Second World War. The Trojan horse was that the Germans had a very good trade agreement for their merchant ships with the Norwegians. Their merchant ships could call on any Norwegian port with a 24-hour notice. This is the identical agreement, by the way, that we have with the Chinese today. The Chinese merchant ship can call on an American port, and within 24 hours we have to allow it to dock. Now, what the Germans did in 1940 is that instead of loading their merchant ships with merchandise, they loaded them with troops and sent them to the normal ports that they usually conducted trade in. When the German merchant ships reached the ports, they opened up, and the soldiers came out of the merchant ships, seized the ports and the heavy offloading equipment so they could offload their artillery and tanks. It's very interesting that control of port facilities and the agreement the Chinese have with us give them a similar kind of opportunity. And I would suggest that a crisis in which the Chinese may be preparing to invade Taiwan, some of the ships that they load may get in the shell game switched off with merchant ships and sent towards North America. That they might be able to get some elite units here into some of our ports to get control of them. And I'll also remind you what happened in Oakland, California not long ago, where the customs found the Chinese attempting to smuggle 100,000 rifles, 2,000 machine guns, and 100 freight cars of ammunition into the United States. This is an astonishing quantity of ammunition. Now, granted, this is not artillery or tanks or heavy weapons, but it is enough to equip light troops. And if these light troops are supported by nuclear missiles, weapons, or bombers, they might be quite effective in the confusion created afterwards. So there are some suspicious things. Now, as far as heavier weapons, we have all heard these stories about Warsaw Pact equipment being stored in places like Montana. People in the militia getting all excited and taking pictures. And the U.S. government says, well, you know, there's no conspiracy here. We've merely bought this equipment from defunct East Germany, and we're shipping it and we're stockpiling it for whatever later on. Well, it's a rather dangerous thing to stockpile Warsaw Pact equipment deep in American territory where Russian paratroopers might be able to land near it and then go to it and then actually activate it. It's almost like we'd be setting up, stupidly on our own part, the arms caches for the Norway operation, only on a much grander scale. I mean, I don't know the details of these negotiations where the communists sold us this Warsaw Pact equipment, but it could be something rather sinister. Now, once, of course, they establish control in these ports, it is a normal blitzkrieg operation. The interior of the country is bombed. Any large American military unit that forms would not be able to supply itself because they would merely nuke its supply source. And resistance would not extend, they would imagine, beyond 9 months. They would be able to occupy the country, they hope, within 9 months. Now, they anticipate very heavy partisan activity. And Colonel Skirdo, one of the Russian strategist, writes extensively about the partisan activity. He uses World War II as a model. The number of German troops and tanks and airplanes destroyed by partisans is staggering. And the Russians expect that kind of resistance from us. In fact, when I talked to Colonel Alunev, I said, well, couldn't they just nuke us and drop 10 paratroop divisions in northern Canada? You know, it's 130,000, 140,000 men and just march down and take the whole country? He said, no. I said, why not? He said, those paratroop divisions would be dead within 2 weeks. Now that's the impression I got from reading their literature. They do not underestimate us. And that is why they are making all these elaborate preparations. Now, how come our establishment doesn't understand what's going on? Well, this is from the front page of the Los Angeles Times, and it's from 1990, when Germany was reunified, and the West German Interior Minister survived the assassination attempt against him, and he came up with these files. You see, the communists were outmaneuvered by this brilliant man, and he found out where they were keeping their files on all the agents they had in West Germany, and though they tried to murder him and it failed, he survived the assassin's bullet, and lo and behold, they found that there were 5,000 to 6,000 communist agents in West Germany operated by the East Germans alone. That doesn't count what the Russians had, what the Czechs had, what the Poles had, what the Romanians had, what the Hungarians had, or the Chinese for that matter. So, how many are in America? The number one target, if there's 5,000 to 6,000 in Germany. Well, there was a book written about 20 years ago called Inside the KGB, and the author of that book estimated 50,000 East Bloc agents recruited and operating on American soil. We don't know the exact numbers. We know it's rather large. How do they manage to recruit so many people? Well, I think the answer can be found in a number of sources, and it has to do with the nature of our society, of our free society, and its particular vulnerabilities. But the most interesting vulnerability to me is the narcotics trafficking and organized crime angle. Joseph D. Douglas Jr. in his 1991 book, Red Cocaine, uses Major General Sena's knowledge of the drug trafficking strategy to discuss this whole issue. In the early 50s, Mao Zedong, the dictator of communist China, came up with the idea of waging an opium war against the West. Maybe some of you remember how the English waged an opium war in the 1840s against China, forcing China to take opium imports. The Chinese thought of the same thing. Well, when Khrushchev heard about this, he said, hey, we ought to do this. We can do this a lot better than the Chinese. And so he set to work, and they did studies. This is what Pry writes about the trafficking strategy and its evolution. Soviet strategy for revolutionary war is a global strategy. Soviet narcotic strategy is a subcomponent of this global strategy and is best understood in this context. While a major target of this activity is often thought to be the underdeveloped world, this is not the case. Soviet strategy and tactics were developed for the whole world, within which the most important sectors were the industrialized nations and the most important target, the United States. Now, when did we start developing our drug problem in this country? It turns out it started getting worse after this Soviet narcotic strategy went into high gear. What else can we find out about it? They were interested in this not mainly to poison our youth, although the Chinese had this idea and the Cubans had this idea of poisoning our youth. But the Russians were interested in the organized crime angle, and this is what Douglas writes. Because of the close association between organized crime and narcotics, the Soviet entry into organized crime deserves closer scrutiny. The decision on organized crime was made in 1955. It, too, was to be a global operation, targeted against all countries, not just the United States, along with France, Great Britain, Germany, and Italy, were primary targets. And he continues, he says, the Soviets put together study groups to analyze organized crime, identify the main groups, and develop the strategy and tactics for infiltrating those groups. Very interesting. Now, how successful were they? 1955, 1998, 43 years. How far have they come? In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Lenin's Tomb, David Remnick wrote the following interesting passage. Russia has bred a world-class mafia. According to Luciano Violente, chairman of Italy's Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry into the Mafia, Russia is now a kind of strategic capital of organized crime, from where all the major operations are launched. He said that Russian mob leaders have held summits with the three main Italian crime organizations from Sicily, Calabria, and Naples to discuss drug money laundering, narcotics trade. Russia, he added, had become a clearinghouse for the drug market. How successful have they been in organized crime? They're hosting the three Italian mafias in summits. They're outlining how they can make their organizations more efficient. We know, maybe some of you remember the movie The French Connection, where they were importing heroin through Corsica. You've probably all heard about the Corsican Mafia. Well, it turns out that one of the first groups that the KGB got involved with in drug narcotics trafficking was the Corsican Mafia. And the French Connection was one of these Soviet operations. Soviets were very big. They dominated the heroin trade at the beginning. Heroin was their main drug to go into at first. Now, it's rather curious how the whole thing works, because now we come to this next passage, which is most eye-opening and goes to the heart of the reason for this. The main reason for infiltrating organized crime was the Soviet belief that high-quality information on political corruption, money and business, international relations, drug trafficking, and counterintelligence was to be found in organized crime. The Soviets reasoned that if they could successfully infiltrate organized crime, they would have unusually good possibilities to control many politicians. Now, what sort of politicians do you think that would be? See, I think they found our Achilles heel.
Yeah, that's right.
I think they saw this 40-plus years ago. If you wonder why our government's not reacting properly, why the CIA seems blind and paralyzed, I think that we will find that the key to all this great mystery, is right here, in organized crime and drug trafficking. It's very interesting. These people who've come out of Clinton's machine, like Larry Nichols and Terry Reid. Terry Reid ran a CIA front company in Arkansas when Bill Clinton was governor there. One of his missions was to help organize the supply of the Contra resistance to the communists in Central America. In his book, he outlines how Clinton was in bed with the CIA, I should say involved with the CIA, rather. Clinton has that habit of doing things improper there. But he got in with the CIA, And they were running these guns down there. But what Terry Reid says is the planes were coming back from Central America loaded with cocaine. Now that's interesting. Because when some of the heat got on Clinton about this operation, he said, look, you've got to get out of Arkansas. It's causing me too much trouble. And they moved it to Mexico. And when Terry Reid was in Mexico, this is what he claims in his book. He claims that Amram Nir of Israeli intelligence came to him and said, you know this Felix Rodriguez, the CIA boss that's running the guns down there for you through your front company here in Mexico? And the arms were coming still even then from Arkansas. He said, this Felix Rodriguez is a KGB agent. He's been working for the CIA a long time, but when he was working for the CIA in Southeast Asia, he got dirty with drugs and they turned him. They made him into a double agent. And he's been working for the other side ever since. And we're really concerned because he's very close to George Bush. And anybody or anything this guy touches is going to be dirty and will be subject to blackmail. And of course, Terry Reid mentions the fact that Barry Seal, one of the people who flew those planes filled with drugs, had some of this blackmail information on George Bush. I mean, that's the claim. Now, I'm not saying this is true, but it rather fits this overall picture of subversion through drug trafficking operations. Everyone who comes in contact with this operation it can be put into prison. Their career can end. And so you have this situation where Bill Clinton is at the receiving end. Now, according to both Larry Nichols and Terry Reid, Clinton was responsible for laundering the drug money from this operation. What Larry Nichols says is that Larry Nichols had been the publicity director for ADFA, the Arkansas Development and Finance Authority, and what he claims, at any rate, is that ADFA was one of the agencies they were laundering the money through. Now, we got to add on a little bit more besides this blackmail angle on Clinton. You know, Clinton was an anti-war protester and a draft evader during the Vietnam War. Now, who were we fighting in the Vietnam War? The communists, exactly. Now, Clinton didn't protest against the war because he was a pacifist. He protested against it, I think, because he was for the other side. In fact, he worked for a Soviet front organization, a peace front, in Europe when he was a student at Oxford. And he also made a trip behind the Iron Curtain in the winter of 1969 to 1970. And he went by himself. He did not speak Russian or Czech, the two primary countries he visited. And he was back there for 40 days. Now that, in itself, is a little bit alarming. But there's more. Some years ago, I met Derek Shearer, a good friend of Bill Clinton's. I didn't know it at the time. This was when Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas still. And Derek Shearer was working for one of the Chicago Seven. He was working for Tom Hayden, who at that time was married to Jane Fonda, Hanoi Jane, who's now married to Ted Turner. And he was doing this campaign for economic democracy, in which he was talking about how to bring a new kind of political philosophy to America. And I was dragged by some radical friends of mine to hear this talk on the campus of the University of California at Irvine. And I puzzled over it as I heard it. I thought, well, what's the difference between communism and this economic democracy? And so at the end of the talk, I went up to Derek Shearer and I said, Mr. Shearer, what is the difference between your economic democracy and communism? And he kind of looked at me and he looked at the people I was with and he said, I probably shouldn't say this, but there is no difference. And then I discussed with him for almost an hour why this subterfuge was necessary. And he said, because communism is a perfectly good idea, but the American people have a knee-jerk reaction against it. Well, see, I didn't know it at the time, but Derek Shearer's half-brother, Strobe Talbot, was Bill Clinton's roommate at Oxford. And later on, I ran into other communists, one of whom mentioned Bill Clinton specifically as a great hope for the future for them. Now, I don't know if Bill Clinton's a communist. I'm not saying he is. I'm just relating what people have told me and what the testimony of others has been. And then we see that the president is against strategic defense. He's against civil defense. He doesn't like the military. We've heard the stories about his daughter jumping out of the limousine saying, "I won't ride with that general," because her parents loathe the military. So what I'm suggesting is that this red cocaine operation may explain our current internal political turmoil and problems. We may have the red cocaine president, and that big trail of bodies people talk about behind the president. It might not just be the Dixie Mafia. It might be the red cocaine cartel. But these are things for Congress to look at. I would end my talk here today by telling you all that the danger is real. Our enemy, our old enemy, the Soviet Union, is still there in disguised form, preparing to attack us. And they have prepared this attack well with deception and with the infiltration and subversion of our political system. And that we do not have much time left. If the Y2K affects the Russians, they may have a use it or lose it proposition. They may have to fire those rockets before the 1st of January 2000. And so I thank you for listening. I wish you all the best, and